The authorities of Baghdad made a fatal mistake. They thought that if they burned the heretic's body and threw the ashes into the river, they would destroy his memory forever. But the moment Hallaj's dust touched the water, the Tigris went insane. The river foamed, surged by several meters, and began to flood the city, threatening to wash away the very judges who had passed the sentence. Eyewitnesses swore the foam on the waves formed the words, "I am the truth." This is the story of how an attempt to silence a man led to nature itself screaming on his behalf. On the 26th of March in the year 922, the sprawling, sun-drenched metropolis of Baghdad did not wake to the familiar, rhythmic cacophony of its bustling markets or the scholarly hum of its madrasas, but rather to a suffocating, unnatural silence that hung over the Tigris River like a shroud of lead. The great circular city, usually the pulsating heart of the Islamic Golden Age where the air was perpetually thick with the scent of roasting meat, exotic spices, and the ink of philosophers, had been transformed into a grim amphitheater for a spectacle that promised to be far more than a mere judicial execution. In the central public square, a space typically reserved for the haggling of merchants and the laughter of children, a dense ocean of humanity had gathered, pressing shoulder to shoulder in a hush so profound that the rustle of a single robe sounded like a thunderclap. They had not come to witness the punishment of a thief or a murderer, crimes which were understood and easily categorized by the human mind. They had gathered to watch the destruction of a man who had committed a transgression so terrifyingly abstract that it threatened to unravel the very fabric of their reality. The object of their morbid fascination was a gaunt, bearded figure clad in the tattered rags of a wandering ascetic, his wrists and ankles bound by heavy iron chains that clanked with a mournful, rhythmic tolling as he was led toward the towering wooden scaffold. This was Mansur al-Hallaj, the mystic whose name had been whispered with a mixture of reverence and dread from the marble courtyards of Cordoba to the dust-choked bazaars of Samarkand, and who stood accused of a blasphemy so profound that blood was the only ink capable of redaction. The crowd watched him not with the burning hatred usually reserved for enemies of the state, but with a primal, trembling horror, for the man approaching his death did not behave like a condemned prisoner walking to his doom. There was no trembling in his limbs, no pallor of fear upon his sunken cheeks, and no desperate pleas for mercy falling from his cracked lips. Instead, al-Hallaj moved with a shocking, buoyant lightness, almost dancing under the weight of his irons, his step springy and eager as if he were a bridegroom approaching the nuptial chamber rather than a heretic approaching the gibbet. His eyes, set deep within his skull, burned with a terrifying, luminous intensity that made those nearest to him recoil, for it was not the light of madness, but a clarity so absolute it scorched the soul of the beholder. To the tens of thousands of eyes fixed upon him, that gaze seemed to reflect the fires of the hell they believed awaited him, yet to al-Hallaj, the scaffold was not an instrument of torture, but the final, necessary threshold he had spent a lifetime seeking. He looked upon the executioner's block with the hunger of a starving man looking at a feast, for he knew that the steel blade was the only key capable of unlocking the cage of his flesh and releasing the divine secret he carried within. The terror that gripped the assembly stemmed from the knowledge of his crime, a crime that was not an act of doing, but an act of being. He had dared to utter the forbidden phrase, the words that belonged solely to the Creator and which no created tongue should ever pronounce, Ana al-Haq, I am the truth. In the rigid, orthodox world of Baghdad, this was the ultimate usurpation, a declaration that the boundary between the clay of man and the light of God had ceased to exist within him. By claiming to be the truth, one of the 99 sacred names of Allah, he had declared that his ego had been annihilated, burned away by the fire of divine love until nothing remained in his jubber but God himself. To the scholars and the jurists, this was the height of satanic arrogance, a chaotic poison that had to be purged before it could infect the faithful. But as Hallaj approached the foot of the stairs that led to his physical destruction, he glanced at the silent, terrified masses and smiled, a serene, beatific expression that chilled the blood of the onlookers more than any scream could have. It was the smile of a man who knew a secret that the rest of the world was too afraid to learn, a man who understood that they were not about to kill him, but were merely about to help him complete his masterpiece. The air in the square grew heavy and static, charged with the invisible tension of a cosmic error about to be forcefully corrected, as the mystic began his final ascent, his chains singing a song of liberation that only he could hear. Perched high above the dust and the heat of the square, separated from the common rabble by a platform draped in expensive carpets and the heavy authority of their office, sat the jurists and theologians who had condemned the mystic to death. They were the guardians of the law, men who had spent their lives memoizing the intricate architecture of jurisprudence and the rigid boundaries of dogma, swathed in robes of fine damask and brocade that signified their status as the pillars of society. Yet, despite the pomp of their station and the steel of the guards flanking them, their faces were drained of color, resembling pale wax masks melting under the relentless sun of Baghdad. Beneath their turbans, beads of cold sweat gathered on their brows, betraying a terror that had nothing to do with physical danger. They knew, with a sinking dread in their guts, that they were not merely passing sentence on a wayward heretic, but were attempting to legislate a phenomenon that defied the very physics of their theology. They were trying to use the limited logic of ink and paper to contain a man who claimed to have swallowed the ocean of the divine, and the impossibility of the task terrified them more than any army ever could. Hallaj had shattered the fundamental law of their universe, a transgression far more dangerous than theft or sedition, by daring to utter the phrase, Ana al-Haq, I am the truth. In the ears of the orthodox, this was the ultimate, unforgivable usurpation, a theft of the divine identity itself, for the truth was one of the 99 sacred names of Allah, a title belonging exclusively to the Creator. By applying it to his own finite, mortal frame, he had, in their eyes, committed the supreme act of satanic pride, collapsing the infinite distance that must always exist between the master and the slave. They saw a man drunk on arrogance, a madman claiming equality with the Almighty, and their legal texts demanded that such a cancer be cut out before it could metastasize and infect the body of the faithful. However, looking down at the calm, luminous face of the prisoner, the judges felt a gnawing doubt that they could not voice, a whisper in their hearts telling them that their interpretation was inverted. For the Sufi, the declaration was not an act of self-aggrandizement, but the ultimate act of self-erasure. Hallaj had not claimed that Mansur was God, he had claimed that Mansur no longer existed. He had walked the path of mystical annihilation, burning away his ego, his desires, and his very identity in the fire of divine love until the vessel was completely empty, leaving room for nothing but the presence of the beloved to speak through his lips. He had become a void, a hollow reed through which the breath of God blew, and thus the I in his statement referred not to the man, but to the divine that had filled the vacancy of his soul. He had become a living, breathing mirror, polished to such a terrifying brilliance that no one in authority could bear to look into it, for in his reflection, they saw only their own spiritual inadequacy. He exposed the hollowness of their rituals and the vanity of their scholarship, showing them that while they worshipped the ink of the Quran, he had merged with its author. The death warrant lying on the table before the chief Qadi was therefore signed not merely with black ink, but with the trembling hand of existential fear. The establishment understood that if this man were allowed to live, if this dissolving of boundaries were permitted to stand, then the entire structure of their society, the hierarchy of caliphs, judges, and priests, would crumble into the abyss of chaos. If a rag-clad mystic could bypass the law and unite directly with the Absolute, then the intermediaries were obsolete, and the order of the world would dissolve into anarchy. They were killing him not because he was a liar, but because his truth was a fire too hot for the clay vessels of their institutions to hold. Their verdict was a desperate attempt to restore the line in the sand between heaven and earth, a line that Hallaj had casually stepped over, and so they condemned him to the most brutal death imaginable, hoping that by destroying the mirror, they could forget the reflection they had seen within it. The executioner, a towering Nubian slave whose skin shone like polished obsidian under the Baghdad sun, stepped forward to commence the ritual of destruction. He was a man bred for violence, his face a callous mask of professional indifference, void of either malice or pity, merely a heavy, breathing instrument of the Caliph's will designed to dismantle the human form with surgical efficiency. In his hand, he gripped a scourge of braided leather, its multiple thongs weighted with jagged shards of lead and glass, an implement created not just to punish, but to flay the spirit from the bone. At a subtle nod from the chief Qadi, the arm rose and fell, the whip cracking through the stagnant air with the sound of a tearing canvas, landing upon the mystic's exposed back with a wet, sickening thud that echoed off the stone facades of the surrounding buildings. The first blow tore through the tattered rags of the prisoner and bit deep into the flesh, opening furrows that instantly welled with bright crimson, yet Hallaj did not flinch, nor did his posture break from its serene, upright alignment. The executioner fell into a grim, rhythmic cadence, swinging with the inexorable precision of a pendulum ticking away the final seconds of a life, each strike landing with a brutality that turned the skin of the Sufi's back into an unrecognizable tapestry of raw meat and exposed vertebrae. The vast ocean of spectators, who had gathered with a morbid hunger to witness the breaking of a heretic, stood frozen in a collective paralysis of confusion that slowly curdled into panic. They were accustomed to the theater of the scaffold, they knew the script by heart, where the lash brings the scream brings the plea for mercy, and the plea validates the power of the law over the transgressor. They waited, breath held in their chests, for the inevitable cry of agony that would humanize the monster and prove that his flesh was as weak as theirs, but the silence from the victim was deafening. With every stroke that should have shattered his resolve, Hallaj remained mute to the pain, his eyes fixed on a point in the heavens visible only to him. Then, a sound finally broke from his throat, but it was not the guttural sob of a broken man, it was a low, melodic chuckle that swelled into a soft, joyous laughter, bubbling up from his chest like water from a spring. This unnatural mirth, rising amidst the carnage of his own body, was infinitely more terrifying to the crowd than any curse or wail of despair could have been. It shattered the logic of the punishment, turning the torture into a grotesque mockery of itself. To the mystic, drunk on the wine of divine intimacy, the lash was not an instrument of pain, but the caress of the beloved, stripping away the heavy, cumbersome layers of the ego to reveal the jewel of the soul beneath. He laughed because he saw the executioner not as a tormentor, but as a liberator, a helpful servant who was diligently working to destroy the cage of the body so that the bird of the spirit could finally take flight. He threw his head back, his face splashed with his own sweat and blood, and looked at the sky with the rapturous expression of a lover receiving a gift, transforming the bloody scaffold into a holy altar. The judges on the high platform shifted uneasily in their seats, gripping the arms of their chairs with white-knuckled fear, for in that laughter they heard the crumbling of their authority. They realized with a chilling clarity that you cannot punish a man who has already died to the world, and that their steel and leather were powerless against a heart that had turned the very agony of death into a gateway of ecstatic union. The theater of cruelty shifted gears from the rhythmic agony of the lash to the irreversible finality of cold steel, marking the transition from punishment to dismantling. The executioner, breathing heavily from the exertion of the scourging, cast aside the blood-slicked whip and reached for the heavy, curved scimitar resting on a block of wood, the metal gleaming with a hungry, silver malice under the unforgiving sun. A signal fluttered from the raised dais where the judges sat, a simple, bureaucratic wave of a hand that condemned a man to become a living ruin. With a movement practiced in the dark dungeons of the capital, the executioner seized Hallaj's right arm, the very limb that had penned the ecstatic treatises and the forbidden poetry of union, and forced it onto the chopping block. There was no hesitation, no theatrical pause for the benefit of the crowd. The blade descended with a blur of motion and a sickening, wet thud that resonated in the pits of thousands of stomachs. The hand, severed cleanly at the wrist, tumbled into the dust like a discarded glove, while a sudden, violent geyser of bright arterial blood erupted from the stump, painting the wooden planks of the scaffold in a shocking, vivid scarlet. The crowd let out a collective gasp, a sound like the air being sucked out of the square, many turning their faces away to retch, unable to witness the desecration of the human form. Yet, the mystic did not scream, his body jerked with the violent trauma of the amputation, a biological reflex he could not control, but his eyes remained wide and clear, fixed on a horizon that transcended the butchery. Before the onlookers could process the horror of the first mutilation, the executioner moved with grim efficiency to the second phase of the sentence, seizing the mystic's left leg. The sword rose and fell once more, shattering bone and severing sinew, leaving Hallaj balancing precariously on one bloody stump, a broken figure swaying in the wind of his own mortality. He slumped to the blood-soaked floor of the platform, physically diminished, reduced to a fragment of the man who had walked up the stairs only moments before. The blood was leaving him in torrents, pooling around him in a dark, widening lake, and by all medical logic, he should have been spiraling into the grey fog of shock and unconsciousness. However, what happened next was a defiance of biology so profound that it would be seared into the collective memory of Baghdad for 1,000 years. Fighting through the waves of agony that must have been crashing against his mind, Hallaj pushed himself upright, sitting amidst his own gore with the dignity of a king on a throne. He raised the bleeding stump of his right arm, not in a gesture of surrender or a plea for mercy, but with a strange, deliberate purpose. He brought the raw, pulsating wound to his face, and with a slow, ritualistic motion, he began to smear his own hot blood across his cheeks, his forehead, and his beard. He rubbed the crimson fluid into his skin with the care of a man applying perfume before a wedding or water before prayer. The crowd watched in a stunned, suffocating silence, their minds reeling at the grotesque beauty of the act. To the uninitiated, it looked like the final descent into madness, the erratic behavior of a mind shattered by pain. But Hallaj, seeing the confusion and the horror in the eyes of those nearest to the scaffold, sought to teach them one final lesson without uttering a word. He knew that the loss of blood would soon drain the color from his face, leaving him pale and waxen, the pallor of a coward or a corpse. He refused to meet his beloved looking like a man afraid of death. He was the bridegroom of the divine, and he adorned himself with the only cosmetic available to a martyr, the redness of his own life force. He was performing wuju, the ritual ablution required before prayer, but for the prayer of love that ends in self-annihilation, water is insufficient, only blood can purify the pilgrim for the sanctuary of the truth. He painted his face red so that when he stood before God, he would appear flushed with joy and vitality, turning his own execution into a holy sacrament, and in doing so, he transformed the gruesome spectacle of the state into a triumph of the spirit that no sword could ever cut. By the time the sun had begun its final descent, casting long, bruised shadows across the execution square, the physical vessel of Mansur ul-Hallaj had been reduced to a grotesque assemblage of severed limbs and trunk, a silent testament to the brutality of the law. However, the paranoia of the caliphal court was not assuaged by the mere cessation of his heartbeat. The viziers and the high priests, men who understood the dangerous mechanics of martyrdom, knew that death often serves not as an end, but as a potent fertilizer for the seeds of heresy. They looked upon the broken remains not as refuse, but as potential relics, fearing that if even a single knucklebone or a lock of matted hair were allowed to remain in the world, it would become an idol, a nucleus for a shrine that would draw pilgrims from the ends of the earth to worship the memory of the man who became God. The existence of a grave would grant him a geography, a place for his followers to gather and whisper his forbidden poetry, and so the order was given for total, absolute obliteration. The sentence was not merely execution, but erasure. He was to be deleted from the material plane as if he had never existed at all. Soldiers piled wood and soaked logs in black, viscous naphtha around the base of the scaffold, building a pyre that was intended to consume the evidence of their cruelty. When the torch was applied, the fire roared to life with a hungry, chemical hiss, enveloping the mutilated body in a shroud of orange and blue flame. The air, already thick with the copper tang of blood, was soon choked with the heavy, greasy smoke of burning flesh, a scent that caused the remaining spectators to cover their faces with their headscarves and weep into the fabric. Yet, in the minds of the secret admirers of the Sufi, this fire was not a punishment, but the final, necessary stage of his alchemical transformation. He had longed to burn like a moth in the flame of the divine candle, and now the state was unwittingly granting his final wish, liberating the last heavy particles of his earthly existence and sending them spiraling up into the ether as pure smoke. The fire raged for hours, fed by the oils and the fat of the man who claimed to be the truth, until the flames finally exhausted themselves, leaving behind nothing but a heap of glowing embers and a mound of fine, grey ash on the scorched stones. There was to be no burial, no janazah prayer, and no marker. The ashes were allowed to cool under the watching eyes of the guards, who ensured that not a single speck was stolen by the wind or a daring thief. When the embers had turned to cold dust, the soldiers brought out heavy burlap sacks and began the grim task of sweeping up the residue of the mystic. They scraped the stone clean, collecting every grain of carbon and bone dust, sealing the essence of ul-Hallaj into the rough fabric containers. The commander of the guard had received specific, strict instructions regarding the disposal of this dangerous particulate matter. It was not to be buried in the earth, for the earth remembers. It was not to be scattered to the wind, for the wind carries seeds. It was to be given to the water, the great dissolver, which washes all sins and memories out to the abyssal anonymity of the sea. Under the cover of the deepening twilight, a small procession of soldiers carried the sacks through the winding streets of Baghdad, heading toward the banks of the Tigris River. They climbed the spiral stairs of a high minaret that overlooked the dark, sluggish current, the weight of the sacks heavy on their shoulders, unaware that they were carrying a substance that retained a spiritual mass far greater than its physical weight. They stood on the balcony, looking down at the black water that had sustained their civilization for millennia, and prepared to commit the final act of desecration, believing that the river would simply swallow the ash and carry it away into oblivion, silencing the voice of the heretic forever. The moment the coarse burlap was inverted and the grey cascade of particulate matter struck the obsidian surface of the Tigris, the laws of nature seemed to fracture. The river, which had flowed with the lethargic, silent weight of centuries, did not simply swallow the remains of the mystic, it recoiled. A low, subterranean groan vibrated through the limestone foundations of the city, a sound so deep it was felt in the teeth before it was heard by the ears, as if a leviathan sleeping in the silt had been stabbed awake. The water did not ripple, it boiled. A violent, frothing turbulence erupted at the point of impact, churning the dark current into a white, phosphorescent foam that glowed with a ghostly luminescence under the rising moon. To the horror of the soldiers peering over the parapet of the minaret, the river began to heave and swell, defying gravity and the season, rising with a terrifying velocity that suggested the water itself was trying to flee the riverbed or, perhaps, trying to climb the walls to consume the city that had murdered its lover. The floodwaters breached the stone embankments within minutes, lapping hungrily at the foundations of the palaces and the mosques, sending the rats scurrying from the sewers in a squealing tide. But it was not the volume of the water that drove the inhabitants of Baghdad to their knees in prayer, it was the shape of the chaos. As the waves crested and broke against the shore, the foam did not disperse randomly. In the swirling eddies and the whitecaps, the terrified onlookers on the banks and the judges watching from the safety of their high balconies saw impossible, fleeting calligraphies form and dissolve. The water seemed to be writing in the Kufic script of the angels, spelling out the name Allah over and over again in a loop of liquid devotion. More chilling still, the froth coalesced into the very shapes of the forbidden letters, Alif, Nun, Alif, spelling out the heresy for which the man had been butchered, Ana al-Haq, I am the truth. The river was screaming the confession that the court had tried to silence. The executioners, men who had severed limbs without blinking, now cowered against the stone of the minaret, realizing with a dawn of freezing horror that they had not destroyed a criminal, but had engaged in war against a force of nature that was intimately connected to the Creator. Just as the panic threatened to spark a riot and the waters threatened to swallow the lower districts, a solitary figure pushed through the line of trembling guards on the riverbank. It was the servant of Hallaj, a man who had watched the martyrdom with dry eyes, carrying the last earthly possession of his master, his tattered, blood-stained wool jubber, the cloak of the Sufi. With a prayer whispered into the gale, he cast the garment onto the raging surface of the water. The moment the fabric touched the waves, the roar of the Tigris subsided into a whimper. The violent swelling collapsed as if the river had been offered a peace treaty it could accept, the water receding back into its channel with a heavy, satisfied sigh, carrying the cloak down into the depths to wrap the scattered ash in a final embrace. The physical threat had passed, but the metaphysical landscape of the city had been irrevocably altered. The ash of Mansur al-Hallaj was no longer a distinct substance, it had dissolved, molecule by molecule, into the lifeblood of the land. It seeped into the groundwater, it was drawn up by the roots of the date palms, and it evaporated into the clouds to fall as rain upon the just and the unjust alike. The authorities had sought to erase him, to ensure that no grave would exist for pilgrims to visit, but in their ignorance, they had accomplished the exact opposite. They had turned the entire Tigris into his reliquary and the whole of Mesopotamia into his shrine. From that night forward, no one in Baghdad could drink a cup of water without wondering if they were consuming the atoms of the saint who had burned with the fire of God. The phrase, I am the truth, was no longer just a sentence written in books or spoken by a mystic, it became a part of the biological reality of the people, flowing in their veins, waiting for the moment to wake up and set them on fire from the inside, proving that while you can burn a man, you cannot incinerate the truth, you can only set it free to become the air that the world breathes.